Thanks, everybody. It's great to be back in Bedford. So Mandy's mentioned my talk here last year, but actually Bedford holds a very special place in my heart because it was 2 years ago that I gave my first talk on this theme. And just to dwell on an autobiographical note for a second, I must tell you that when I gave that talk 2 years ago at Panacea, I was very, very nervous. I was very worried that one of two things might happen. Either that I would just depress everybody, and everybody would say, well, that's pointless then. And of course, if everybody says that, then we know that everything's finished, because if people just give up, then everything's just going to go to SHIT. The other thing I was worried about was that I would be attacked, that people would say, how dare you say this stuff? It's defeatist. Shut up. And neither of those two things happened. The audience were really quite rapt and fascinated. And I was like, oh, wow, maybe there are people who are ready to listen to this tough message. And since then, I've been giving these talks, and my whole life has completely changed. Because he's helping us to think about the kind of things we need to think about. My whole life has changed because it has become clear that there is a big audience out there of people who are hungry to hear the truth, and not just the rubbish we've been told for years of, oh, it's going to be okay, just change your light bulbs and don't worry, we'll get through it all fine. So to spend a few minutes now on the situation as it is in reality, and not in the fantasy land of everything is going to be fine. What hasn't changed since 2 years ago, the basic situation. The basic situation is extremely grim. There is a very simple way that I can illustrate to you why it's so grim. And it's amazing that this fact isn't more widely known. So consider a gallon of petrol or a litre of petrol in one of your cars. I know we're all very green here, but I'm sure that many of you, like me, have a car and use it sometimes. When you burn that petrol, it produces heat and it makes your engine go round, and that's all good in a way for your purposes. Also, of course, when you burn that petrol, it gives off carbon, right? And the carbon goes up into the atmosphere, CO2. And the carbon stays up there for decades, or indeed for centuries. It's one of the fundamental aspects of the crisis that we're in. That CO2 lasts for centuries, most of it, in the atmosphere. What do you think is the ratio between the heat that is given off when you burn the petrol and the heat that is generated by the greenhouse effect in the atmosphere from the carbon from that same gallon of petrol? Yeah? So you burn the petrol, you get heat, the heat you want. Yeah? The carbon gets released, it generates heat through the greenhouse effect. What do you think the ratio of the two is? Do you think it's maybe about the same amount of heat from the greenhouse effect as from the burning of the petrol? Maybe twice as much? Anyone want to have a guess?
10.
About 10. Maybe the greenhouse effect multiplies by 10 the amount of heat you get from the petrol. Should I tell you the actual figure? It's about 30,000. Yeah, that's why we're in this crisis. That sounds incredible. How can it be? Well, go back to what I said a moment ago. The carbon dioxide stays up there for hundreds of years. Day in, day out, it's just doing a little bit of heating, a little bit of heating, a little bit of heating, and that adds up. You burn the petrol in your car engine, it's gone in minutes. The carbon will be there for hundreds of years. Fossil fuels really are weapons of mass destruction. They are weapons of mass ecocide, mass murder, and mass suicide. And that's why we're in the crisis that we're in. And people are trying to do stuff about that. You've got the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, however, is little more than a sticking plaster. Its targets are inadequate. No country has plans to achieve its own targets. Every country has plans that contradict its own targets, plans to build new motorways, plans to mine new coal, plans to open new airports, etc. We're in real serious trouble. Okay, now what's changed over the last 2 years? Well, two things have changed, essentially, since I gave the talk a couple of years ago in Bedford, and to some extent since I gave the talk last year. The first is that things have got worse, right? The first is that we've started to see our weather spiraling out of control. We had February, for example, this year, right? How wonderful to be able to eat an ice cream on the beach in February. But if you think it's that hot in February, what the hell is it going to be like one of these days in July or August? Think of the heat wave last summer that we had in this country. It baked a lot of our crops, basically. Crop yields in East Anglia for many crops, including, for example, onions, dropped by between 30 and 40%. Now imagine if the heat wave had gone on into August, September, those drops would have been 50, 60%. At some point, there isn't enough food, right? And that's what this is really about. People talk a lot about sea level rise, and yeah, that's a concern for all sorts of reasons we could talk about. But the much more immediate worry is about food and about water, yeah? If we don't get a grip on this, we're going to be having food crises periodically or regularly soon, and sooner or later there will be famines and people will be starving. And of course that's already happening in various other parts of the world. But don't think we're immune here because this is a so-called developed country. Very important fact about Britain, we can't feed ourselves. We produce 60% of our own food. Right? We rely on being able to import food from other countries in very large quantities all the time. Well, how's that going to work when those countries start struggling to feed themselves because their crops are being baked? We're not immune. Things have got worse. How else have things got worse? Bolsonaro in Brazil. He's trashing the Amazon. Absolutely catastrophic. The worst possible thing you could do. Trump in America, tearing up all the environmental regulations. Things are extremely grim. But there's one other thing that's changed since 2 years ago, and indeed since last year. And that is that for the first time, there is now a serious counter-reaction. For the first time, there are now people organizing in the way that Mandy mentioned that give us hope, right? Consciousness in this country was transformed by Extinction Rebellion earlier this year. Hugely exciting, historic development, such that suddenly, after 2 weeks of occupying the streets of London and 1,000 people arrested, we had a clear majority of the British people saying, yes, there is a climate emergency. Yes, the government needs to act seriously on it. Yes, I'd be willing to vote differently, for example, as a result of this. And the environment shooting up the agenda, such that it's now ahead of immigration as an issue, ahead of the economy as an issue on people's minds. This has never happened before. 2 years ago when I gave my talk here, I had pretty much zero hope, and that's why I gave such a stark talk. And very much the same last year, really. Over the last year, everything has changed in that regard, and we now have the right to have a little hope. What can we hope for? So, this little book of mine, as you've heard, has the cheery title, "This Civilization is Finished," but let me explain that title slightly. What we cannot hope for is that we will find a way of perpetuating this civilization as it exists. That is just not going to happen. That ship, if it was ever seaworthy, has sailed long ago. What we need to do now is a very rapid emergency-style World War II mobilization to change everything. And once we've changed everything, civilization as we know it will look incredibly different. The future will be far more local, whether we like it or not. The food you eat will be grown far more locally, whether we like it or not, right? The only question is, are we going to be intelligent enough to make that shift voluntarily, or are we going to have it forced upon us by our society collapsing? The future is going to be low carbon, whether we like it or not. Are we going to be intelligent enough to make that change voluntarily, or are we going to have it forced on us by collapse? Over and over again, that is the issue that we are now facing. So what I mean when I say this civilization is finished is that there are three choices before us. Either we intelligently change our civilization into something very, very different that can last, or this civilization collapses and we manage to seed a new one out of the ruins, which again will be able to be one that can last, or this civilization collapses and that's it. Hopefully we'll avoid the third one. The second one would be a lot better than the third one. And there are things that we can do to prepare the way for that now, if that's what's going to happen. The first would obviously be the best of all, and that's what we should be aiming for. But we can't assume any longer that we're going to make it. We can't assume any longer that we're going to avoid some kind of collapse event as we go on pumping these weapons of mass destruction into the atmosphere constantly, even now. even after declaring a climate emergency. But we do have some hope now. I believe that we do have some hope now that we might just be willing to change everything, and that even if we don't, we're going to be starting to prepare ourselves for what comes next. So, what does that mean in terms of what ought to be done? How should we prepare ourselves for what is coming? How should we build on the hope that we now have? Well, let me say a tiny bit more about hope. What is hope? Hope isn't sitting around kind of thinking, oh, I really wish that such and such would happen. That doesn't do us any good at this point in history. The kind of hope that we need is active hope. The hope that we need is embodied in what we do. Yeah? So it would be a very rash person at this point who would bet on us being able to survive the enormous crisis, the long emergency that is coming. But there is something else that we can do, which I describe in this way. We can bet ourselves. Yeah? We can put ourselves into the picture. And that's what people have been doing this year. That's what the climate school strikers have been doing. That's what Extinction Rebellion has been doing. And it's been having real effects. So we've got these climate emergency declarations all over the place, and people are now using those to try to hold their politicians to account. Politicians are starting to change some of the things that they do. Just starting, but they are starting. A concrete example, in Scotland, they decided not to reduce a tax on air flights that the Scottish government there, the SNP government, were going to reduce. It's very clear that they did that. They made that decision not to reduce that tax because of Extinction Rebellion. The May elections this year were very different because of this change of consciousness. You had the Green Wave, which saw Lucy and others being elected as Green councillors. Lucy and others have been doing great work, pounding the streets, putting themselves up for election for a long time. And until this year, we didn't have such a high success rate in the Green Party. We broke through in a big way this year. The Green Wave, it's called, that's very clearly a result of Extinction Rebellion and the climate school strikes. You don't have to be someone who's a member of the Green Party or whatever to think that that's an ideal outcome. You just have to accept the obvious fact, which is that a lot more people voted Green this year because this stuff was on their mind. And what comes next? Well, Extinction Rebellion, as you've heard, is active here in Bedford. It's active all over the country. It's active in large parts of the world. It's spread like absolute wildfire. And it's going to be coming back onto the streets in a big way later this year. Extinction Rebellion will be supporting the adult strike that the climate school strikers have called for the latter part of September. This is a fascinating new development. Greta Thunberg and her friends, her young friends, have said to adults, we've been striking every Friday, now we want you to join us on the 20th and the 27th of September. Do put that in your diaries, very important dates. If that works out, if that becomes something big, that will be hugely significant. That will be another historic development from this year. And then Extinction Rebellion itself will be relaunching its full-scale rebellion in October, probably around October 7th. That date isn't certain yet, but it's worth putting in your diary. Why am I stressing that so much? There are many really good things that you can do at this point in history, right? In my opinion, a really good thing to do is to join the Green Party, help out Lucy, etc. Another really good thing to do is to learn to grow your own food, teach others to grow their own food, etc. That protects us to some extent against the likely coming crisis or potential collapse. And it takes away money from the big supermarkets and intensive agriculture, which is highly climate damaging and damaging to biodiversity. There are many other good things to do. Some of them are represented here in this hall. Many of you are part of them. But what is clear is that if we are going to make it through this crisis, or at least if we are going to put down the seeds for a future civilization that will emerge from a collapsing version of this civilization, then we need to do big, game-changing things, and we need to do them fast. And that's why the climate school strikes are so important, and that's why Extinction Rebellion is so important. It's changed the whole conversation in a way that I didn't really dare to hope was possible when I was giving the talks I was giving here 2 years ago, or even last year. And so that's why, as I say, even though the basic underlying situation has not improved, and in some important ways things have got worse over the last year or two, that's why I'm coming here to speak to you today with a message that actually is a message of hope. Because people, as the situation gets worse, are waking up to that, are starting to change, and are betting themselves in a way that I think gives us real hope. And that's enormously exciting. So if you take one thing away from this talk in terms of a sort of practical ask, I would say to you, whatever else you do, whatever you're involved with, please plan on being involved in Extinction Rebellion this autumn. This is the biggest game changer of them all. We've proved that in April. We're going to try to take it to a whole new level in October. Please plan on coming to London in October and being on the streets with us for a while. If possible, plan on being one of those people who's willing to be arrested, because unless we have people who are willing to be arrested, unless we have people who are willing to do non-violent direct action and take the consequences, we don't have anything. But if you're not able or willing to do that for whatever reason, then please think about how you can support others who are able and willing to do it, who I'm sure include some people in this room. Okay, in a minute, I'm going to throw it open to questions for you. And then, as you've heard, after the questions, which we'll have a long time for, a lot of time to go into this, because that's really important. This is heavy stuff. It's important to be able to really talk about it and think about it. Anyone who wishes to can buy one of my lovely books here. This Civilization's Finished, and the other one, the Greenhouse one, Facing Up to Climate Reality, which is, well, what this is all about. But before we do that, I want to do a little exercise with you. Because, you know, doing the best for the future of the world is not a spectator sport, as I've already made clear. And I want to try to get you thinking and feeling about it in a way that really involves you. So what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment is to commit yourself to doing the utmost that you can do in this historic struggle, at this historic moment. Because I want to put it to you that the worst thing, the worst possible outcome for you and for us would be if collapse does occur and we're forced to say to ourselves, God, you know, I really should have tried harder. If we'd have just put some more into this, maybe we could have stopped this from happening. That's the worst possible outcome. We can't be certain that we will succeed in our endeavors. Yeah? We can't be certain that we'll be able to stop a collapse. We can't even be certain that that collapse won't be terminal. Much of this is out of our control and out of our power. What is in our power is what we decide to do in this crisis. And what is in our power is to give our utmost. So I put it to you that the worst thing would be for you to have to look in the mirror or look in the eyes of your children in 10, 15 years' time and say, God, I'm so sorry we didn't do more, because maybe we could have stopped this. So I'm not asking you to do anything that's not possible. I'm not asking you to do more than you can do. I'm not asking you to do it alone, because I'm speaking to you as a group here. We're a group of people talking together here. And I'm asking all of you in this hall to think, how can we do our utmost to stop this? And maybe that'll inform the questions. And as I say, I want us to do this in the form of a little exercise to make it real. I want to invite you to do this. It's not necessarily going to be easy, but I think you could find it an extremely powerful exercise if you take it seriously. So what I want you to do is to pair up with someone in the room who is younger than you. Now, obviously, this will only be possible for half of you, right? Don't all look for someone who's younger than you, right? But find a pair where one of you is clearly older than the other. If you're about the same age as the person you're sitting next to, find someone who's clearly younger. And there are quite a few younger people, for example, at the back, and then some scattered around the audience. You don't have to be young, just younger, yeah? If you can't easily find some individual person who's younger than you, then you can go in a group of or 3 or 4, such that there's clearly at least one person in that little group who's younger. So can I give you a minute to kind of sort yourselves so that everyone is with someone who's younger than them, if you see what I mean? So what I want to invite the older person or people, if it's a larger group, to do is to look into the face of the younger person in the little group with you, right? Look into the face of that person, and I want you to say roughly these words, and to take a moment and not make a joke of it or anything. Treat this really, really seriously. Say it like you mean it. Look into the eyes of the younger person that you are with. So this only applies to the older people. The younger people, you don't have to do anything except witness, yeah? And say, I will do my utmost to make this future livable. I will do my utmost to make your future livable. I want to invite you to say that in a moment now. Okay, well done. Thank you. And now I'm going to invite you to change it just very, very slightly. Again, bringing consciousness to the fact that we're doing this together. And the older people, I'm not asking you to feel guilty or whatever. I'm simply asking you to commit to doing what you can and to be aware as you do it that we're doing this together. And I've done this myself. I've said this myself to others before. This is going on in other rooms as well. So this time the form of words to be as follows, please. We will do our utmost to make your future livable. We will do our utmost to make your future livable. Try saying that now, if you would, please. Thank you very much. Thanks for taking that seriously. And now let's have a lengthy discussion about this, including about any feelings that may be coming up. Thank you. So yeah, what I discovered over the past couple of years is there's a huge appetite for telling the truth, and that's the basis for a kind of realistic hope, rather than the kind of nonsense fantasy hopes that we've been mostly fed, and that you build that hope when you start to act, but that also we need to talk about this stuff, that it's pretty intense, etc. And that's what you've been doing the last few minutes. We've now got quite a long time to talk together about it a bit. So. Who would like to kick off? Any questions or comments? Yes. Absolutely, that's a great question. So let's start out by thinking about telling the truth. That's what I've been trying to do for the last couple of years. You know, I was thinking about this stuff for a long time, and I didn't dare to speak about it because I thought no one wants to hear the truth. If I say this, I'm just going to be shot down, etc. As I say, that hasn't happened. And I've been so pleasantly surprised that it hasn't happened. And then Extinction Rebellion came along, and its first demand is tell the truth. And that just resonated directly with me. And I thought, oh my God, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. This is what I've been hungering for, and it hasn't existed. So I threw myself into it, and I've been active in it since last September, since the beginnings. And I think that the demand number one of Extinction Rebellion, tell the truth, is actually the most important demand. I think everything else flows from that. If you don't have that, you don't have anything. Now, your question is, okay, so Extinction Rebellion's demand number one is tell the truth. Well, are they willing to listen to the truth? First thing I'll say about that is I think telling the truth is about all of us all the time. In other words, Extinction Rebellion's demand number one is phrased as governments must tell the truth and the media must tell the truth. But I always add to that, I say, we must always tell the truth as well, and we mustn't sugarcoat it, etc. If we're not going to be the truth tellers, who is? So, that's what I do, and I think, by and large, that's what Extinction Rebellion does. Now, because of the April Rebellion, we have started to have the chance to have actual, real discourses with government, which is pretty remarkable, really. So a few days after the rebellion ended, I was in a room with some other Extinction Rebellion top activists in detailed discussions with Michael Gove, the DEFRA secretary, and various other government ministers. Wow. That's a start. You can watch it on video if you want to. It's available. We made sure it was recorded so that no one was like, ooh, what are they doing behind closed doors? No, there were no closed doors. What's my experience been of those meetings so far? Because we've now met more recently with Gove again. We've met with John McDonnell. We'll be meeting soon with the Lib Dem leadership candidates within that party. We've met with Caroline Lucas. There'll be a meeting later this month with the whole Labour Shadow Treasury team, which is quite exciting. What's been the response? Well, you know, you have to be very careful with politicians, especially intelligent, powerful politicians from the old parties. They're very good at saying one thing and doing another. But I have to tell you, my response to their response has so far been kind of one of guarded, kind of pleasant surprise that they are more willing to listen and to start to change things than I'd expected. What would be an example of that? Well, one example of that is that when we had our first meeting with Gove, we said to him, you've got to start telling the truth about British carbon emissions, right? Because the government's been saying for ages, oh, we've got this brilliant record on carbon reduction, we've reduced 40% since 1990, we've reduced 25% in just the last 7 years, everything's going in the right direction. And of course, that's basically just lying with statistics, because they leave out the air travel, they leave out the sea travel, they leave out all the emissions in all the products we buy from China and India and so on and so forth. They leave all those out of the figures. So we said to Gove, you've got to stop lying about those figures. And he sort of nodded and smiled. And the next day in Parliament, when amazingly the climate environment emergency was declared by Parliament, Gove in the debate was lying with those figures again. I emailed him and said, you promised, blah, blah, blah. Okay. We met with him recently, and I brought it up again, and I said, look, you know, you're still not telling the truth, are you, about these figures? And he said, you know what, we've been thinking about that, there's going to be a new chief scientist soon, and I'm instructing him to start producing proper figures for us that include sea travel and air travel and embodied emissions. So it hasn't actually happened yet, but he has now said, I have instructed, you know, one of my top aides to do this. That is a little bit of progress in the right direction. I think the real challenge is that, I go back to what I said a few minutes ago, I don't think we are really telling our full truth yet. When you meet with a politician, or when you meet with a civil servant, it's incredibly tempting to kind of soft pedal your message a bit, to kind of find a way that you can relate to them and that they won't dismiss you as a crazy, yeah? So what we're planning to do in these upcoming meetings with the Lib Dem leadership candidates and with the Labour Shadow Treasury team is we're planning to make sure that we don't do that. We're planning to lay it more strictly on the line. We're planning to give, if you will, little versions of the talk that I've been giving and the kind of talks that other people such as Jem Bendell have been giving now for a little while, and to really try to get them to understand just how terrible it is. Because I think actually a lot of the time, their own civil servants, their own aides, their own scientists are probably kind of trying to kind of downplay it a bit in the way that the media generally do. So it's a complicated, long answer. I apologize for it being long. It's a complicated issue and a very, very important one. I'm guardedly optimistic, but I think that the chances of politicians really listening will be raised when we really tell the truth. And also what we need is we need more whistleblowers. We need more people to come forward from within corporations, from within government, from within universities to say, well, this report has been squashed, this worst case scenario hasn't been properly raised, this question isn't being asked, etc. If more of those kind of people come forward, and who knows, maybe there's one or two people who have some whistles to blow in the room, that would be incredibly helpful. You're a member of Parliament. Oh, excellent. I did not know that. Thank you.
Since last year, I've been paying more attention towards green issues. And the politicians higher level than me, the minister, the chair, solution to move on.
Well, firstly, let me say I'm really delighted that you're here. I hope we get to have a quick word afterwards. And also, just to say something very briefly on the target, I'm delighted you say we should go for carbon net zero by 2030 rather than 2050. That's really encouraging. Extinction Rebellion's target is even more stringent than that, of course. We believe it should be 2025, which is incredibly demanding, but we think that the precautionary principle and the science is increasingly pointing in the direction of that being what it needs to be. That, of course, makes it even harder and makes your question even more pointed and pertinent. I don't have a silver bullet answer to your question. One thing I would point out is that Extinction Rebellion's third demand is for citizens' assemblies to decide, with expert advice, how we're going to meet our much more ambitious new carbon reduction target and biodiversity targets. So hopefully the process of expert deliberation and citizen deliberation may come up with a good answer to a question like the really hard question you're asking there. Just to put one or two sort of parameters around the question, I think it's very clear that there isn't going to be a future if we try to build a future around cars. Even transitioning to electric cars is not enough. Electric cars would be, on a very large scale, would be an enormous new investment in materials and wouldn't be affecting the kind of absolute paradigm shift that we need if we're going to have this move that I tried to describe earlier to a new civilization. So what do I think the future should look like? Well, my vision of it, as I gestured at earlier, is it's going to be a lot more local. So there's going to be a lot less travel in the first place. There will be good public transport. So there should be electric buses and electric trams and electric trains, but very few electric cars. Now, that's going to sound very challenging to a lot of people who are reliant on their cars, and certainly it's going to sound challenging to taxi drivers. Maybe some of those taxi drivers can drive electric taxis. Maybe some of them can drive electric buses. Maybe some of them can drive, or rather ride pedicabs or things like that. They might think that's a bit of a come down to have a glorified bicycle rather than a car. There are various advantages, including, for example, that they're likely to live longer. Perhaps they can be sold on that. But I'm not going to try to give you a full answer to the question. I think it's a really good question. I think it's a really tough question. That's the kind of thing that we need to decide together. But we do need to decide it together. We do need to figure it out somehow. Because if we try to imagine a future which is centered around the same number of cars going on, even if they're electric, it's not going to do the job. Thank you so much. Maybe we'll have a word. Beautiful, very important question. I think it's absolutely clear that the reason why the April Rebellion was so successful is because 1,000 people were willing to make a, not enormous, but not at all non-negligible sacrifice. They were willing to sacrifice their liberty for a while and sacrifice their clean criminal record or whatever in most cases. And it was that won people around, the fact that we were sticking by our beliefs and were willing to really make sacrifices to bring this onto the agenda and to get consciousness changed and to get action starting to happen. When one thinks about the kind of future that I have been gesturing at a bit and the kind of future that would be entailed by carbon net zero in 2025 or even 2030, it can seem as though thinking of it in terms of sacrifice is the best way to think about it. We're going to have to sacrifice our cheap foreign holidays. We're going to have to sacrifice our high levels of central heating, whatever it might be. But I actually think that at a deeper level, that's not the right way to think about it. Because what we should be trying to do, and I believe that this is possible, it's still possible, may not be for much longer, but it's still possible, is that we could actually create what will genuinely be, on balance, a better society if we make these changes. A much more relocalized society is a society where people have much better community. It's a society where they have better security. It's one where there's much less of a problem of loneliness. I mean, there's an enormous epidemic of loneliness in our culture. The future will probably do away with that, and it could do away with it in a wonderful way. I think we shouldn't, as we try to describe what society, if we, as it were, get our way, will look like in, say, the 2030s. I think we shouldn't say, well, you have to give up this, that, and the other. I think we should say, yeah, there won't be any more of those things, and we'll be focusing on these things instead. And guess what? Actually, it'll probably mean that you're, on balance, happier, healthier, physically healthier, mentally healthier, etc. Also, an even more fundamental way of thinking about this. At the end of the day, as I tried to gesture out in the little exercise we did together, what this is about is whether we are going to be able to bequeath a livable future to our children and our grandchildren. And pretty much whatever you have to do to be able to do that is, I believe, something that you will be willing to do. So if you have to give up your cheap foreign holidays and give up your private car and so on in order to attain that, at the end of the day, it's no sacrifice, right? It's no sacrifice to be able to save your children and save the future. Or at least, as I described, to be able to say to them, look, I absolutely tried everything I could. I really did my best. I didn't just SHIT all over your future, yeah? So in that sense, it seems to me that the concept of sacrifice is really, really interesting and deep. What we're really trying to do, to put it extremely bluntly, is avoiding sacrificing our children, right? What we're really trying to do is avoiding spilling their blood for our dispensable pleasures, which don't even make us very happy. And if we can give it our best shot to save the future, that is no sacrifice. Thanks.
What is your opinion politically speaking about the lobbyists and stuff in political circles and the corruption from large corporations?
It totally happens. I think we all know that, right? It happens in the British Parliament in various ways. I'd be interested in our friends here, our friends' thoughts on that. It happens in the European Parliament. It happens through the media. So what are we going to do about it? There's lots of people trying to work on that in various kinds of ways. The way I'd like to address that is by saying something about the way Extinction Rebellion thinks about that. Well, first basic point is, obviously, there are all sorts of ways in which our democracy is imperfect, like very, very imperfect, right? That's one of the most important. Others include our really terrible electoral system, and we could go on. So what Extinction Rebellion says is, we want to have a democracy. We want to radically improve the democracy that we have. And we have to work with what we've got, but we have to work with it in a way that is going to transform it, almost certainly, if we're going to get what we need. Because the current system hasn't given us what we need. It is starting to change a little bit, but are we really confident it's going to change far enough and fast enough? So that's why we call for citizens' assemblies. And there's various ways in which that could be done. So another incredible success of Extinction Rebellion, not everyone in the room may be aware of this, is that a couple of weeks ago, 6 select committees in the House of Commons simultaneously agreed to have a citizens' assembly which will look at these issues. Very, very exciting, unique development. Again, a result, a success of our movement. These citizens' assemblies are very imperfect, as in the way they've been laid out by the select committees. They don't, in our opinion, have an ambitious enough goal. They won't meet for a long enough period of time. And most importantly, they don't have any legislative power. They are merely advisory. But it's a little step in the right direction. What would we like to see? We would like to see citizens' assemblies that were actually empowered by Parliament, by government. They might include politicians in them, but they certainly wouldn't have a majority of politicians. I say they might include politicians in them because one very interesting fact about citizens' assemblies in the world over the last few years is that one of the most successful models is from Ireland. And in Ireland, the Constitutional Convention, which was basically a founding citizens' assembly, had politicians in it. And that gave it, that made it easier, it seems to me, for the politicians to go along with the idea of it. And it gave it a bit more kind of credibility. It made it was more listened to, and it was listened to. It was acted upon, and the results of all that have to do with the legalizing of gay marriage and the change of the law on abortion in Ireland, plus some stuff on climate. It's been achieved as a result of citizens' assemblies in Ireland. Whether or not these citizens' assemblies have politicians in them, they need to have real power, in our opinion. They mustn't just be talking shops. And our fundamental thought there is, this is a way that we can create a more real democracy in this country and bypass a lot of the corruption that comes from corporate lobbying and so forth. Yeah? Now, here's one really interesting way, it seems to me, in which we might be able to win this. And this is going to be a big feature of the rebellion resumption later this year and probably next year as well, really trying to win powerful citizens' assemblies. I think that some politicians are starting to wake up to the fact that it's quite challenging for them to lead on this issue because of corporate lobbying, because citizens are often behind them, because people haven't had the truth told to them. Part of the fundamental idea of the Citizens' Assembly would be, this would be people who would be told the truth, yeah? And they'd be able to deliberate about it, to think about it, to reason about it together, and to come up with answers. And I think that some politicians are starting to understand, actually, this could be a really smart way in which we could move policy forward in this area and not be blamed for it, right? In other words, if the Citizens' Assembly comes along, you know, selected from ordinary people like you and I, and says, right, we need these really stringent targets, we need to do this and that, we need to do this and that on cars, this and that on heating, etc. Politicians can say, government can say, look, you know, we haven't made this happen, this is you who's made this happen, right? It'll make it easier for them to implement it. So that is another part of the beauty, I think, of the Citizens' Assembly concept. It enables politicians to start to do things which they think it's difficult politically for them to do. And that really is what Extinction Rebellion exists to do, to make what seems politically impossible into the politically possible. And we've seen that starting to happen this year. That could carry on into the future, and citizens' assemblies could be the way that it gets done. And that's the beauty, I think, of the third demand of Extinction Rebellion. I think that's absolutely right. What we need is revived, powerful local government in this country. The country's become far too centralized. And what we need to make that work is local government that gets revived partly through local citizens' assemblies. I think that could be a really exciting part of what may happen in the next couple of years. And people could make that happen. It wouldn't necessarily have to happen all over the country all at once. You know, you could have a citizens' assembly that was agreed upon for Bedford, say. And you could invest it with some actual decision-making power, and it would bring power closer back to ordinary people. We've got time for maybe a couple more questions. Yes?
I was just wondering about going back to sort of personal actions. There are a few simple actions that we can make which would massively reduce our emissions from GHG wherever them. What do you say, about us being truthful, what do you say there's going to do with my family and friends?
Yeah, it's fascinating the way people do that, don't it? I recycle, so it's all okay. Yeah, I think the point to say to them, if you can get a little bit of attention from them, is at this point in history, just recycling doesn't cut it, right? We're way, way past that. And people need to be trying to lead in their own actions towards a better future. But the most important thing that we can do as individuals is be part of something larger where we try to change things together, right? And that's one reason why in this little exercise we did earlier, I said, in the second round I said, we will do our utmost. That's what it's really about, right? Working with other people, whether that be in a permaculture group or in a Green Party or in some other party or in Extinction Rebellion. The transformation in public consciousness, which has penetrated in so many ways, in so many unexpected places. You've had a lot of people in the Conservative Party waking up. You've had a lot of people in business waking up. And there was in the second week of the rebellion, there was a letter published in the Times from business leaders saying, we agree with Extinction Rebellion. I mean, that's just absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. That could happen. Not saying something like, well, they've got an interesting point, let's talk about it. We agree with Extinction Rebellion. This kind of transformation of consciousness is happening, it's growing, and it's happening because people got together and did something together that they couldn't do as individuals. And when you make it be about individual actions, when you make it be about, you know, going vegan or not flying or something like that, then you get all sorts of kind of difficult personal reactions. You get people feeling like they should feel guilty and so on and so forth. That's not really the point, right? The point is we have to do it together. So So absolutely, you know, I've taken a pledge not to fly next year. I eat very little meat. There's lots of good things that we can do as individuals. But the stuff we do as individuals, you add it all up, there's no way that it's going to be enough. We have to change as a society. We have to change as a continent. We have to change as a species. And the only way we're going to do that is if we do it together. We really are all in this one together, in that sense. So I would say when you're talking to your family or whatever, try not to turn it into sort of guilt trips about individual things that they do. You know, you could even say to them something like, well, look, actually, if you really want to go on that flight, you know, fine. But in return, tell me that you're going to come with me onto the streets of London in October. And then, you know, and then I'll be happy for you to take the flight, you know, if that's what it costs, right? Because if we manage to pull off a whole new level to this transformation this autumn, that's when we could start to see mega changes like Heathrow expansion stopped, regional airports getting closed down, the kind of things we need to do. Thank you. And a final question, yeah.
Have you any comments to make? Can you explain why we withdrew from the plan to close down Heathrow? The reason I was personally very sad and disappointed about that was...
Okay, yeah, thank you. Interesting question. Yeah, sure. So this gentleman, in case anyone doesn't understand, is referring to the fact that Extinction Rebellion was going to target Heathrow and going to try to shut Heathrow down during this summer. And then at the last minute, that was called off. Although it was actually only postponed, really. And the plan now is to go ahead with a similar, although somewhat scaled down, more carefully designed action in September. And yes, you're quite correct. The reason why it didn't go ahead is because of internal argument over it within Extinction Rebellion. There were a lot of people, and I was one of them, who were nervous that unless this action was done absolutely right, then it could piss an awful lot of people off, an awful lot, and it might not be non-violent. The worry was about the potential use of drones. Which is very different from the kind of thing we did in April. In April, it was all about sacrifice, right? It was all about putting our own bodies on the line in the streets in London. But the plan to shut Heathrow down quite centrally involved the use of drones. And I think that you have to be very, very careful when you're doing something like drones, especially after what happened at Gatwick recently, to make absolutely certain that there's no way that that could be, that could involve any violence or any possible harm. So the new plan to go against Heathrow in September is more carefully designed in such a way that there is still a plan to use drones, but it's designed in such a way that those drones, there's really no way that they could be involved in any kind of violence or harm. To say something briefly more about how that's going to work, basically it would be things like the drones would be flown at head height. You know, you'd fly a drone like that. And that is a technical breach of the rules within a 5-kilometre radius of Heathrow, so Heathrow wouldn't be able to fly planes while it was being done. Another advantage of the new plan is that it gives people enormous notice. So anyone who wants to take a holiday in September can't say, I want to take my holiday and bloody Extinction Rebellion stop me. We're saying now, you know, don't fly from Heathrow in September. Don't buy a ticket to go from Heathrow in September. So useful information to any naughty people in the room thinking of doing so. One comment from me on this. I'm still unconvinced that the idea of shutting Heathrow down is the best idea anyway. It's an interesting discussion, but let me briefly explain to you why. I think it's really important that as well as doing stuff that affects everybody, Extinction Rebellion does some stuff that affects more disproportionately the rich and the privileged and those who burn most carbon. Right? So my proposed alternative plan to shutting down Heathrow is seeking to shut down London City airports. Because London City Airport is basically only used by business people and the super rich with private jets. And I think if we did that, it could be a really smart way to make clear to the average person in the street, as it were, that Extinction Rebellion is well aware that some people are more equal than others in this game, and that the people whose lifestyles are going to have to change the most are not people like most of the people in this room. They're people in the 1%, basically. Those are the people that have to change the most if we're going to have a livable future together. So that's, again, the sense in which we're all in this together. So I hope that's a reasonable answer to your question. It's a very interesting, important topic, and I'd be happy to talk about it more.
Not quite, in the sense that
Well, the point, sorry, I should have explained. London City Airport has plans for expansion which are similar to Heathrow's plans. They are planning to double their number of flights in the next 5 years. So the point would be to say, no, you're not going to do that. And actually also to say, in a bigger sense, that London City Airport in the longer term should be probably moved towards closure, because it is an airport which is basically only for the rich, which is inappropriate, and it is an airport which, because of its location, causes even more misery than most other airports in terms of noise and pollution. So yeah, of course we've got to stop Heathrow being expanded if we're going to have any chance of meeting our climate targets. We've also got to stop London City Airport being expanded if we're going to have any chance of meeting our climate targets. We could talk about that more, but I think we need to stop. I'll be happy to talk to people more. I've got my books. It's been a super question and answer thing. We've got it all filmed and recorded, so this will be made available if you want to share it with other people who couldn't be here today. I hope that there'll be ways in which that gets released to people in this room within, the next couple of weeks? Yeah, something like that. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Thanks so much for your time and your attention.